Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. How are you?
I'm fine, Akhi Raihan, and hello everybody, and welcome to this episode.
Alhamdulillah. Good, good. Welcome to everyone. Welcome everyone.
So, Raihan, Akhi, we are on episode 7, and we are on page 81, and we are about to begin the section sorting through the sightings of Jesus. Just to recall, if I remember rightly, we were talking about Paul's perspective on what constituted Jesus's resurrected body, it being more spiritual, while the Jewish understanding, I believe, was more of a physical body, if I remember rightly. And that's what I recall. That's as much as I recall, top of my head.
Yeah, no, that was the core of the chapter. We're on chapter 3 at the moment. The title is Reading the Gospels in the Light of Paul. So now James Tabor is trying to explain to us why it's logical and rational to read these four Gospels in the light of Paul's theology and writings, rather than the orthodox way of reading those Gospels independently. So should we?
Yep.
I mean, before we start, do
Uh-huh.
you want to add anything else, or should we just crack on?
Yeah, I'm actually remembering now. I
Sure.
think from a historical perspective, I think James was saying that when Mary Magdalene, according to the gospel accounts and what the biblical accounts, when Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of Jesus, basically entered the tomb, and there was a child there saying Jesus has risen. He's basically said for the disciples to meet him in Galilee. I think that's in Mark, which is the earliest account. Basically, what's happened is when is it Joseph of Arimathea, if I remember rightly?
Yeah.
Who took the body for it to be buried, had taken the body already to conduct the burial rites. So that's how then some mistook Jesus actually being resurrected to somewhat, and that's how Mark's account believes the actual body of Jesus was resurrected rather than a spiritual, some kind of metaphysical type substance body that Paul was propagating.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, I've rambled off enough. Shall we crack on?
Yeah, sure. And also, the Jewish
Yeah.
understanding when they say resurrection is resuscitation of a corpse, not the way how Paul understood it to be.
The physical body, yeah, or not?
Yeah, but physical, like a new body,
New body, yeah.
new physical body.
John the
Whereas,
Baptist and Herod, yeah.
Whereas the four Gospels sort of indicate that it's the same body that Jesus was crucified and killed. Paul, on the other hand, says that a resurrected body has a different spiritual body, but a different physical body from earth. That was before. So should we start off?
Okay, yep.
Cool. So we're on page 81 now, under the right at the bottom, the subheading sorting through the sightings of Jesus. Inshallah. Bismillah. Do you want me to start, or would you like to start, Idris?
Let me warm up. Let me start. Inshallah.
Okay,
just crack on. Yeah, bismillah. Sometimes clues show up from the most unexpected quarters. In 1886, a fragmentary 8th century AD copy of the Lost Gospel of Peter was found buried in the grave of a monk in Egypt. Eusebius, a 4th century church historian, had mentioned its existence but regarded it with disfavor. It is written in the first person, claiming to be by Peter, but scholars generally place it in the late 2nd century AD. It narrates Jesus' death and resurrection, and scholars have debated without resolution whether it is dependent on our New Testament Gospels or represents an independent tradition. It has a highly legendary flavor to it, with quite a few fantastic embellishments. I think this is the one where I've had Bart Ehrman talk about when they go to the empty tomb, there's a very large cross, and it speaks, and it says, like, Jesus has been resurrected. That's what he means by legendary flavor to it. with a few fantastical embellishments. Sorry, digress there. So whether embellishments. So whether it has much historical value is debatable. At the end of the text, the author seems to retell his empty tomb story in a much more straightforward way. For a second time in the text, but this time almost identical to Mark, it is as if he is passing along two versions, one highly fantastic and legendary, and the other more sober and realistic. In his second version, Mary Magdalene and the other woman arrive at Jesus' tomb, finding it empty. And as in Mark, they encounter a young man who tells them Jesus is risen, and they flee the tomb frightened. The historical final lines of the text before it breaks off read, quote, "Now it was the last day of unleavened bread, and many went to their homes, because the feast was at an end. But we, the 12 disciples of the Lord, wept and mourned, and each one, grieving for what had happened, returned to his own home. But I, Simon, Peter, and my brother Andrew took our nets and went to the sea. And there was with us Levi, the son of Alphaeus, whom the Lord ... unquote. This text is a bombshell in its implications. There's no meeting in Galilee or nowhere. The Passover festival lasts for 8 days, and according to this text, rather than running around Jerusalem celebrating various appearances of Jesus, Peter and the rest of the disciples spent the week in Jerusalem weeping and mourning. At the end of the 8th day feast, they returned home to Galilee, still grieving for what had happened. Each went to his home, and Peter and his brother Andrew returned to their fishing business. This evidence that follows that the followers of Jesus returned home to Galilee in despair and mourning, and even went back to their businesses, and only some time later in Galilee began to have faith that Jesus had risen from the dead, rings true with the rest of our evidence when put in proper chronological order. The body of Jesus resting in a tomb in Jerusalem was no threat to their faith that Jesus, though dead, had been vindicated by God and was indeed the Messiah they had hoped for. That we even have such a text running to counter the reports of appearances of Jesus in Jerusalem the week following his death, given the subsequent embellishments of the Gospels with multiple appearances of Jesus, is quite remarkable. The text also fits in with Mark, who mentions no appearances of Jesus, but also relates a tradition that the disciples returned to Galilee. It is more than likely that the Gospel of Peter, after this abrupt break, goes on to narrate a sighting of Jesus by Peter, Andrew, and the others on the Sea of Galilee, after they had returned to their fishing and gave up hope. Strangely, we have a version of this story tacked onto the end of the Gospel of John, an extra chapter, chapter 21, like an appendix, after the original text had clearly ended with chapter 20. It has been edited to read as if Jesus had already been appearing to the disciples in Jerusalem and now just showed up in Galilee. But it is clear that it reflects an entirely independent source, preserving a story very similar to the ending of the Gospel of Peter. Peter has returned to the Sea of Galilee with a few others, and he has gone back fishing. They are out in the boat when they think that they see Jesus, distantly on the shore. The way the story is related, even though the author of John has elaborated and embellished it, shows that this tradition of a return to Galilee and a resuming of the fishing business was a persistent one. Matthew follows Yeah, go for it.
Yeah, can we just stop there? This is quite interesting. So, from what I've understood, there was a discovery called the Gospel of Peter in the 8th century. So bear in mind, this was after the death of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and in the early church history, Eusebius mentioned about this book, the Gospel of Peter, in the 4th century, but he dismissed it or he disfavored it. And based on the Gospel of Peter, it does mention about the death and resurrection, but it's more towards it closely resembles to Mark's version or Mark's Gospel. However, the crucial point is this: in Mark's Gospel, they were told that the woman were told and the disciples were told to meet Jesus in Galilee, right? Um, how, However, in the Gospel of Peter, it's narrating the same story. However, they were mourning and they were crying, which meant that they didn't expect a risen Jesus, or they were never told that they're going to meet Jesus in Galilee. They thought that, you know what, Jesus died as a Messiah, he's a Shaheed, he's a martyr, and we just go back to our fishing business. So you can see that there is a discrepancy between the Gospel of Peter and Mark regarding what happened after the crucifixion. Um, the scholars have generally mentioned um, that it's most likely dated back to the 2nd century. Now, I know a lot of Christians would say that, well, why should we take the Gospel of Peter seriously? Because even though it's written in first-hand account, it can't be from Peter because it's written in the 2nd century. But we can apply the same with all of the 4 Gospels. Like, who wrote the Gospel of Mark? Nobody knows, but yet they put their faith and their historicity in an anonymous book. So, do you see the double standards here?
Yeah, I do.
Yeah.
It's interesting that there's a synergy between the ending of Peter and the ending of Mark, meaning Mark 16:8, I think it is.
Yeah.
Not because the earliest manuscripts of Mark ends at 16:8 when the women go see the young man who says Jesus has risen, meet them in Galilee. So yeah, there's a correspondence there. But I think what's also important, which I'm still trying to understand, when he references the Gospel of to interpolation in terms of the Gospel of John. What was it? Chapter 2? Yeah, an extra chapter 21, like an appendix, when normally it ends at chapter 20. That Jesus has already been appearing to the disciples in Jerusalem and has now shown up in Galilee. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, that's quite interesting. So it's going to go on to talk about Matthew now. So we've got Mark's interpretation, we've got John's interpretation, we've got Peter's, the apocryphal Peter's interpretation. It's now going to go on with Matthew. Yeah. Matthew follows Mark with his emphasis on Galilee as the place where the disciples first saw Jesus. What he relates is quite telling. Now the 11 disciples went to Galilee, to the mountain to which Jesus had directed them. And when they saw him, they worshipped him. But some doubted. Matthew 28:16-17. Presumably, Matthew is associating a specific mountain as a place of visionary experience, much like his account in chapter 17, where Jesus appears as a transfigured shining being with Moses and Elijah. Many scholars have suggested that the account of the transfiguration, related also in Mark 9, is a misplaced resurrection story. But whether that is the case or not, what we can learn here is that Matthew only knows a single story of Jesus appearing to his disciples. It takes place in Galilee, a misty mountain, visionary experience, and some doubted. If we put all our sightings, evidence together in chronological order from all our sources, including the evidence we have surveyed from Paul, we get an interesting breakdown. One can clearly see how the stories extend and develop. What follows is a basic summary. Paul had his revelation of Christ approximately 7 years after Jesus' crucifixion. He claimed that he saw Jesus in a glorious heavenly body. Twice in his letter, 1 Corinthians, he equates his own experience with that of those who had seen Jesus earlier, based on traditions he had received, namely Peter, the 12, and a group of 500 at once. James, and the rest of the apostles. Last of all, as to one ultimately born, he was seen only by me. I believe that's 1 Corinthians 15:8. And again, I am not an apostle, I have not seen Jesus our Lord. 1 Corinthians 9:1. I want to come back to that. He does not say when or where these earlier sightings by the others took place, but since he mentions the 12, he might be referring at a time when Judas Iscariot, who was dead, had been replaced, which would mean several weeks had passed since the crucifixion of Jesus. Do you want to add anything there, Ryan? Or
No, I think
yeah?
James Tabor is just saying here that if we reconstruct the story in a chronological order, because as he mentioned in the previous page, and as you emphasize, John added an extra chapter, chapter 21, as an appendix to sort of fill in the missing gap of the appearances of Jesus. And I think the paragraph on when he started on the basic summary is the key.
Yep.
That Paul equated his experience, his vision experience with Jesus, like the apostles had with Jesus. Even though Paul never met Jesus, as we all know, but do you know what's really interesting? Matthew chapter 28, verse 16 to 17. Now the 11 disciples went to Galilee, to the mountain to which Jesus had directed them, and when they saw him, they worshipped him, but some doubted. That's a key thing. Some doubted. So this is a clear evidence that it wasn't a consensus, it wasn't with certainty that the disciples of Jesus, thought whether they've seen Jesus or not. Some believed that he was alive, some doubted whether that was really Jesus. And what does Allah say in the Quran? وَإِنَّ الَّذِينَ أُخْتِلَ فِيهِ لَفِي شَكٍّ مِّنْهُ. Those who dispute therein, disagree therein, they're in full of doubts.
Yeah.
So you can see there is a preponderance. There is, it casts aspersions in the doubt of these sightings of Jesus. So even Matthew's gospel, in that particular passage, is sufficient to even suggest that not all disciples of Jesus believe that that was actually Jesus, or that he was risen from the dead. Do you see where I'm coming from?
Yeah, and don't forget the exegesis I showed of 1 Corinthians. I think it's
Yes.
1 Corinthians, where if you take the understanding that the super apostles are the 12 apostles, the 11 and then plus 1, 12 apostles are them, there were doubts in Jesus's resurrection and what that involved. So
Yeah.
even from but I think Matthew, as you said, Matthew 28, 16, 17, Matthew 28, 16 to 17, without any gymnastics, whatever, it clearly says some doubted. So even if you reject the exegesis, that clearly says they doubted. So there's no
Absolutely.
ambiguity there, which is very interesting.
Yeah.
Okay, right. So next paragraph. Mark has no accounts of anyone seeing Jesus, but the young man who meets the women in the tomb and tells them explicitly to go tell the disciples they will see Jesus in Galilee. Matthew relates that the women who first went to the tomb are told by an angel to go tell the disciples that they will see Jesus in Galilee. Okay. As they run to convey this message, they meet Jesus, who repeats the message even more explicitly. Tell my brothers to go to Galilee, and there they will see me. Matthew 28:10. Matthew closes his gospel with the scene on a mountain in Galilee, clearly somewhat later, in which the 11 disciples see him, though he mentions that some of them doubted it was Jesus. Okay, right. So Mark, it's a young man telling the women. Matthew, it's an angel telling the women. The women go to convey, and then they meet Jesus, who repeats it and tell them to go to Galilee. And then they go to Galilee, and then they see Jesus and some doubt. Okay. Luke writes that later on that first Sunday, two men who were walking on a road outside Jerusalem met Jesus and shared a meal with him. At first, not recognizing him. Subsequently, he says that Peter then saw Jesus, but no details were given, only the report. That evening, Jesus appears in the room where the 11 disciples are gathering and eats with them, showing them his physical body of flesh and bones and convincing them he is not a ghost or a spirit. John says that Jesus first appears to Mary Magdalene outside the tomb on Sunday morning. Later that evening, he appears to the rest of the disciples, showing them his wounds. But Thomas is not present. 8 days later, he appears again, where they are staying, and Thomas is able to see and even touch his wounds, which convinces Thomas he is not seeing a ghost. The appendix to John, chapter 21, relates a separate story unconnected to the main narrative and taking place in Galilee, where Peter and the other disciples have returned to their fishing, but see Jesus on the shore from a distance. They come to land, and he is cooking fish on a charcoal fire, and they eat together. The Gospel of Peter ends with the disciples leaving Jerusalem a week after the crucifixion and returning to Galilee. Even though Mary Magdalene and the women have found the tomb empty, the disciples have no faith that Jesus is alive. They are in despair, mourning the death of Jesus, and they return to their fishing business. Unfortunately, the text breaks off at this point. Two important observations emerge from this breakdown of sources. Before we carry on, is there anything you want to add, Raihan, at all, or is it?
No, not at all. I think it's coming to the climax now.
Cool. Okay, so number one, the earliest texts, Mark and Matthew, agree that the disciples encountered Jesus only in Galilee, sometime after the empty tomb was discovered. They are actually told to go to Galilee, where they will see him, since they would not have left Jerusalem until after the 8-day Passover festival ended. Their experiences would have been several weeks after Jesus' death. Matthew's account indicates that whatever account, sorry, I'm messing this up. Matthew's account indicates that whatever encounter they had, it was more visionary in nature and subject to doubt, as a kind of addendum to the Galilee tradition, even though they come later chronologically. The Gospel of Peter and the appendix of John indicate that Peter and others returned to their homes in Galilee, and that Peter and his brother Andrew resumed their fishing business. Okay, so it's all about Galilee and a visionary viewing in Matthew. Number two, the later accounts, Luke and John, but Jesus' appearance in Jerusalem as immediate on the same day as the tomb is discovered empty. Jesus appears as a flesh and blood human being, shows his wounds, and eats meals to demonstrate that he is not a ghost or spirit. The strong impression one gets is that the empty tomb is directly tied to Jesus appearing, and one is dealing here with the idea of resurrection as the literal resuscitation of a corpse. You okay with that?
Yeah, carry on. Yeah.
These dichotomies are quite striking. Where Galilee or Jerusalem? When? Immediately on the day the tomb was discovered, or weeks afterwards? And what? Visionary-like experience or resuscitation of a physical corpse? The internal evidence is decidedly in favor of Mark and Matthew's tradition. To even imagine that the kinds of stories that Luke and John relate, set in Jerusalem, were circulated when Mark wrote his gospel is highly improbable. That Mark could publish the first gospel in Christian history and include no appearance of Jesus, with the focus on Galilee, not Jerusalem, pushes our evidence decidedly in favor of the Galilee opinion. It is also hard to imagine a text like the ending of Gospel of Peter even existing unless it were related to a strong tradition of remembering the despair and sorrow of the disciples following Jesus' death as they returned to their vocations in Galilee, giving up hope. It is not an edifying story, but it is a really realistic one, and it fits our earlier evidence. Okay, so he's leaning with Matthew, Mark, and say that Peter, the apocryphal Peter, 1 and 2 Peter, I think it is holding on to a very old tradition, which is found in Mark, with Mark being the first gospel, and with Mark and Matthew being the earlier gospels. You could probably then decide that the resurrection accounts found later in Luke and John, because they come later in time, their interpolations, basically. That's why they differ, if that kind of makes sense.
Yeah, that kind of makes sense. And so the dichotomy here is Mark and Matthew portrays the aftermath, the empty tomb story, and the disciples encountering Jesus as a visionary experience. Whereas the later development, the later Christological development, which is Luke and John, it's now shifting to a resuscitation of a corpse, a physical resurrection. So now the discrepancy here is that which tradition should we take? And James Tabor then mentions that it's the Galilee tradition that takes precedence, which means that there was no such thing as a physical resurrection in the first place. They just had these visionary experiences, and this is consistent with the Gospel of Peter narrative, where Peter and Andrew and James, they all just got on with their own business. They mourned, they cried, but they went back to Galilee.
And it was weeks later as well.
Exactly, yeah. And they just got on with their own business.
And some doubted.
But some have doubted, exactly.
It's interesting.
Very interesting. Very interesting. And also Bart Ehrman, another thing, on the bottom paragraph where James Tabor, he brings up all these like different dichotomies, where, when, how. I mean, these are not new to those who are knowledgeable Christians, those who are familiar with textual criticism of the New Testament. And Bart Ehrman is well known for highlighting these dichotomies. Like I remember in his debate I think his 2009 debate with Mike Licona, it's just full of his PowerPoint slides. It's exactly the same questions that James Tabor is asking us in that paragraph. So this is nothing new at all. It's nothing new.
Yeah, that's interesting. Very interesting. Okay, would you mind taking over?
No, absolutely. Okay, so we're on page 87, second paragraph. Inshallah. Bismillah. Some have argued that these differences in our gospel accounts are the expected result of reports from a variety of witnesses, but all testify to the same essential fact: Jesus was raised from the dead. Sometimes the analogy of an automobile accident is suggested. When eyewitnesses report what they saw, each reflects a particular perspective, and there are always differences in details, but the essential facts related to the accident are usually the same. Such an analogy fails in the case of the Gospels. First, there are no eyewitness accounts at all. Second, the reports we have don't even agree on where the sightings of Jesus took place, Galilee or Jerusalem. What we have is a series of theologically motivated traditions written decades after the event, removed from both place and time, battling out competing stories of what happened after Jesus died. They cannot be harmonized. Luke even has Jesus telling the 11 apostles that they are not to leave Jerusalem, which closes the door on even the possibility of subsequent appearances of Jesus in Galilee, as alluded to in Mark and recorded in Matthew, Luke chapter 24, verse 49, and the book of Acts chapter 1, verses 3 to 4. Paul is a decisive witness for this reason. He does claim to have seen something firsthand, and he equates his sighting experiences with those of Peter, James, and the rest of the apostles, based on his personal acquaintance with them. Given his view of resurrection of the dead as being reclothed in a glorious heavenly body, he would have found the emphasis on flesh and bones meaningless. When Paul says Jesus was buried, he is indicating that he knows the tradition of Jesus' body being put in a tomb. 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 4. His point is to emphasize that Jesus truly was dead and buried. What was then raised on the third day, just as in the Gabriel revelation, was not the perishable mortal body, but a new spiritual body, no longer flesh and blood, the old body having been shed like discarded clothing. 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 42 to 50, and verses 52 to 54. Do you have any thoughts, any feedback you want to
Just that I remember we were speaking about this during the end of our last session. So it seems like Mark and Matthew somehow are inclined to agree with Paul's spiritual body in terms of the resurrected body, whilst Luke and John are more a resuscitated physical body.
Yes.
Am I right? Okay. And that the only taking the, like, First Corinthians, for example, understood to be a authentic writing of Paul, that when Paul says that I saw Jesus, he's the only first-hand primary eyewitness account we have of this actually happening in terms of all the Gospels and any other claim. The primary source we have is from Paul's mouth himself in terms of his authentic writings, First Corinthians. However, I think what James takes issue with is that Paul is saying he saw a spiritual body, which is a miracle, which is metaphysical, which is not historical in the sense of it being tested from a historical standpoint.
Yes.
I remember we've talked about this in a few, but yeah. So that's how I read it.
No, you're absolutely correct. And the clue here is that Paul was familiar with the tradition that Jesus was buried.
Yeah.
That's very important. I think that's a key takeaway to indicate that Paul did not mean that when Jesus was raised on the third day is how the Christians understand now, which is in a physical body, he was resurrected, touching him, feeling, just like the way how Luke and John portrays. Yeah. What he meant is that is his personal experience of seeing that visionary Jesus, as you said correctly, that cannot be tested historically. And James Tabor brings in the Gabriel revelation, which is it's a discovery where what was the name? Simon of something, sorry. He was like the messianic figure, and he was assassinated, he was killed.
He was in Galilee, wasn't he, as well? From Galilee. Yeah.
Exactly. He was in Galilee, and his body was rotten in the middle of the desert. And yet there are traditions that say that he was raised on the third day. But nobody believed that someone ever recounted, like ever seen Simon, resurrected physically and going around Galilee and talking. No.
And King Herod.
Like King Herod, yeah.
John the Baptist, when they said, is Jesus, the prophet, is Jesus, who is this person? And they said, is it John the Baptist, after he was killed? Herod said, yeah, it might be. Herod had an understanding it might be John the Baptist.
Yes.
But he didn't bother looking at John the Baptist's body.
That's
because
right.
they had the understanding of, as you said, Or as
Yeah.
James said, yeah.
Had Paul understood, on the contrary,
Yeah.
he wouldn't have acknowledged that Jesus was buried, which means that he was familiar that Jesus was dead. He was rotten in the grave. That's how he understood.
Yeah.
So his raised on the third day narrative is just his own subjective personal visionary experience, and not the way how uh, Luke and John portrays as a physical resuscitation, basically. That makes sense. Yeah, very interesting, very interesting. Shall I carry on?
Yeah, yeah, please.
Okay, cool. Um, Jesus' own teaching about resurrection, preserved in the Q source, as we have seen, emphasizes an angelic like transformation in which even the sexual distinctions between male and female are obsolete. Luke chapter 20, verses 34 to 36. This parallels precisely Paul's view of resurrection. Q source, just for your information, Q source is a pre-existent tradition of the sayings of Jesus that predated, even the four Gospels. Um, so why does this shift from Galilee to Jerusalem come about in Luke and John? And why the insistence on connecting the empty tomb with the literal appearances of Jesus as revived from the dead in the resuscitated corpse that had been buried? I think we can assume that the reasons were largely apologetic. These texts come late in the first century and even in the early second century. Sophisticated Greek critics of Christianity, such as Lucian, Trypho, and Celsus, were on the horizon. Their common charge was that Christianity thrived only among the ignorant, simple minded, and gullible classes of society, who were led astray by the foolish tales of deluded women and hallucinations passed off as visions. Wow, that's put in a very strong terms, isn't it? There were also similar rival tales of other divine men circulating, such as Apollonius of Tyana, a a Pythagorean wonder worker, born about the same time as Jesus in Asia Minor, who traveled throughout the eastern Mediterranean world. According to his followers, Zeus fathered Apollonius, so he, like Jesus, was a son of God. According to his biographies or gospels, he healed the sick, raised the dead, and ascended bodily into heaven. Various versions of Apollonius's death were passed along, including one where he was arrested by persecutors, set himself free, and was taken up from the earth into heaven. According to another story, he appeared mysteriously to a doubtful follower after his death and convinced him of the doctrine of immortality. A fascinating stone inscription containing the following epigram has turned up in Asia Minor, not far from Tarsus, where Paul grew up. In quote, this man, named after Apollo and shining forth Tiana, extinguished the fault of men. The tomb in Tiana received his body, but in truth, heaven received him, so he might drive out the pains from men. End quote. Anything to add?
No, thank you, Laihan. I'll wait a bit. Thank you.
Sure, no worries. As with Jesus, there were debates among his devotees as to whether his body remained in the tomb or whether he was assumed bodily into heaven. The early 3rd century Roman Emperor Caracalla built a shrine to Apollonius, and Caracalla's successor, the Emperor Alexander Severus, is alleged to have had a private shrine in which the images of Abraham, Orpheus, Christ, and Apollonius were given divine honors. This is quite interesting. If Jesus' followers came to believe in his resurrection only after a period of despair, and in Galilee, far removed from the empty tomb in Jerusalem, based on visionary experiences, they were surely open to the charge that the entire phenomenon was mass hallucination. Exactly. That Matthew, who gives us our first and earliest account of such a group appearance, says it took place on a mountain, but that some of the 11 disciples doubted, while others believed, was clearly quite problematic for Luke and for John, writing a generation later, Matthew chapter 28, verse 17. That is also why Luke, alone of our four Gospels, records a scene in which Jesus ascends bodily from the earth, taken away in a cloud from the Mount of Olives, just east of Jerusalem, as the 11 apostles stand gazing into the sky. Acts chapter 1, verse 9 to 10. To leave him bodily on earth, eating and drinking in his physical form, simply would not do, since one would presume that, like others raised from the dead by Jesus, he would have eventually died again as he grew older. And John, although he has no ascension scene per se, recalls that Jesus said that he was ascending to where he was before. John chapter 6, verse 62. These New Testament Gospels and the book of Acts take us decades beyond Paul into a time and place that he never lived to see. It is deeply ironic that Paul is in some ways the shadow behind all four of our Gospels. Yet to understand Paul, we need to put the Gospels aside, which means, at least in terms of sources, to learn to read the New Testament backward. If we can resist making assumptions and pick up Paul's letters with fresh eyes, we will capture an amazing moment in time for which he is our only first hand source. We will learn how Paul transformed the original Christianity into a new religion that claimed to abrogate and supersede the old by moving everything from earth to heaven. This is the
Wow.
conclusion of chapter 3.
Okay, interesting. So, I'm not going to say too much on this. What I'd say about just the last piece that was written, it's interesting of the belief in Tarsus where Paul at least grew up, if not was where was born. You know the I'm just trying to find it. Pythagorean, where is it? What according Zeus fathered Apollonius. So he, like Jesus, was a son of God. According to his biographies or gospels, he healed the sick, raised the dead, and ascended bodily into heaven. Various versions of Apollonius' death are passed along, including one where he was arrested by persecutors, set himself free, and was taken up from earth into heaven. And then there's a tombstone where it says, "This man named after Apollo the sun." So it seems like that when we understand at least Paul's understanding or Christology, at least it's synonymous with pre-existing, obviously Jewish without a shadow of a doubt, but also as important, more importantly, I believe, Hellenistic thought. So I think what James is saying is he's taken this Hellenistic thought, you know, him being a Pharisee as he claims, some Jewish thought, and he's mixed it up a bit, and he's brought out, as he says right at the end, his own Christianity. Paul transformed the original Christianity into a new religion that claimed to abrogate. So that's quite interesting. I'm still keen to learn more because obviously there's much more on that, on what that actually means in terms of Paul's Christianity. But I just want to devil's advocate, for lack of a better term. I remember Bart Ehrman saying that, I'm not going to go into detail on this, but I remember something very brief I heard from him recently, where on his channel, where he said that where people say Paul, you know, originated or created Christianity, and again, going back to what they believe Paul's original writings were, those roughly 7 letters, but I was saying, well, according to those authentic letters of Paul, Paul talks about certain beliefs that he got from others. So these were like pre-existing beliefs. So it'd be good. What I'm saying is, it'll be good to delve in as we are to find out what are the pre-existing beliefs, how Paul's beliefs differ from those pre-existing beliefs, and what are the apostles' existing beliefs, and if they differ from Paul, and at times also from those pre-existing beliefs that Paul took. So it's like a triangle. You know what I mean? Paul's belief, pre-existing belief, and the apostles' beliefs, and how and what the relationship is between them all. I just wanted to make that point because when it said that, according to Bart Ehrman, that Paul makes up his own, as James Tabor mentioned, that we've got to take it with a pinch of salt that there were some pre-existing beliefs under the loose term Christianity. And I think a case in point is just to finalize, is Apollonius's death and his persecution and his resurrection and etc. etc. So that's a case in point.
Yeah, thanks for that, Jazakallah khair. Yeah, I mean, from my thoughts on this chapter is clearly illustrates how these contradictory accounts, that in itself is problematic. Not only that, there are theological motives behind making these changes as well. For example, the disciples see in Galilee, and then in another gospel you see disciples appearing in Jerusalem. Also about the Passover as well. So I like when James Tabor, gives the standard Christian, response to all of these contradictory accounts. That it's like, for example, an automobile car got in an accident, and there's so many eyewitness reports that everyone's given their own angles. But I mean, there's two fundamental flaws in the Christian views in this. Number one, there's no eyewitness testimonies. Okay, and number two, clearly there are missing evidence. There are missing links of all of these stories. So these are just
They contradict.
These are just contradictions. I mean, honestly speaking, and some have doubted, according to Matthew's gospel. I don't think when the Christian uses the car crash accident, you would find any eyewitness saying, "I doubted." They all come with a consensus that there's a car crash. Yeah.
I think the good one is to say there was a car crash on Hyde Park Corner, and the other one says no, the car crash was in Brixton, i.e. Galilee, Jerusalem. Yeah.
Yeah.
Was it in Hyde Park or was it in Jerusalem?
Exactly.
Yeah. So you can't, like he says, you can't harmonize them.
Yeah.
And I think I said this a couple of sessions back, just to end, because I'm speaking a bit too much, I believe, on this. But I think when Bart Ehrman talks about the resurrection account, for example, or the crucifixion account, is they are so diametrically opposed that you really can't harmonize them. And if you do attempt to harmonize them, like the what was that gospel that is it the Diatessaron, I think, the harmonizing gospel that they found writings, I think it is
Diatessaron, yeah.
You just end up with the fifth gospel.
You
just end up with the fifth gospel, and so you can't harmonize them. But I think for me, I think that for me personally, to be honest, that was quite sophisticated. In terms of understanding the Hellenistic thought of the body and the resurrection and Hades, and which I did not know in terms of resurrection, incarnation. Sorry, to do with the Greek belief, and then maybe after 7 times, if you're good, you were sent to the heavens to live with the gods, and then the Greek understanding. So that was quite sophisticated, and then obviously the contradictions between all of the gospel accounts and Paul's account. So there was a lot going on there, a lot for me personally.
Yeah, and also just another thing to point out, Luke's gospel is quite unique in that sense, because this is the only gospel account that speaks about the transfiguration. The fact that Jesus was ascended to.
Oh yes, okay.
That plays a
Yes.
significant part as well, because of
So
course,
Matthew doesn't talk about ascending when they see the physical body and there's doubts. They don't see an ascension. It's only in
no,
Luke.
they don't see the ascension. But what
Okay.
Matthew does portray is there's a group appearance. There was a group appearance,
Yeah.
and the most logical conclusion would be that they're all experiencing a mass hallucination, and that's not something that is unusual, because even in past history, even after, you know after the late antiquity, even like the
Fatima.
most famous one is the Lady Fatima, in a
Yeah.
Portuguese valley, where there were so many youngsters, so many Catholics, um, saw Mary. This is not something that's unusual. And as I mentioned before, Bart Ehrman, he mentioned that according to a study in America, one out of eight people experience visionary experiences of their beloved ones who just recently passed away. So it's not something far-fetched or ridiculous. It's, yeah, I believe there was a mass hallucination. Allah alam, Allah knows best. That is a plausible explanation, and that's the reason why some of among the 11 disciples doubted. Um,
I personally think that it was just a full on uh, manipulation and deviation and infiltration of Hellenistic belief
sure,
and um, just total and utter corruption from an Islamic standpoint.
yeah,
Um, yeah, that's what I think happened. They just totally transformed, and um, the crucifixion is no way. Sorry, the resurrection. Well, we talked about the crucifixion as well, but even the resurrection, there isn't. What's the word? Um, Total agreement on it, even within the biblical narrative. It
mm,
shows, like in Matthew 18 or wherever it was, 22, wherever it was, there was doubt. Um, Loosely, as we know, Basilides and others
oh
had,
yeah,
in term, yeah. So what I'm saying is, at the time, it's not a given that Jesus was crucified, let alone resurrected. But look, I've got. Do you want to have an ending comment? Sorry, Lihan, before we move on to the next chapter.
um, no, I think we've covered it. We've given our thoughts and feedback on it. I think the next chapter it's going to be very interesting, because it's now focusing on from resurrection according to Paul's understanding, and that the four gospels should be read in the light of Paul's understanding resurrection. Uh, Now he wants to focus more on the origin of Christianity and how Paul's plays a big part in this. So, yeah, should we start chapter 4?
Right. Yeah. Let me take over because I think you read
Exactly.
last,
Okay.
didn't you?
Thank you, brother.
Right. Okay. So, yeah, chapter 4, titled "Last but not least." Paul believed that God had selected him before his birth for a singular and pivotal mission that would determine the future of the cosmos. Though Jesus had directly chosen the 12 apostles, and in that order, Paul came after them. God's God's choosing him before birth would actually make Paul the first apostle. Paul was further convinced that his specific role in God's plan of salvation was predicted in various prophecies of the Hebrew Bible.
Idris, I think you're frozen. Can you hear me? Yeah, apologies. I think there's a bit of technical issue from Brother Idris' side. Just to recap, we're just starting chapter 4 now on page 91. Um, and the chapter is called Last but Not Least. So just Spare me 1 second. Yeah. I'll carry on. I'll carry on. Where are we again? Sorry, I'll carry on here. Okay. Paul believed that God had selected him from before his birth for a singular and pivotal mission that would determine the future of the cosmos. Though Jesus had directly chosen the 12 apostles, and in that order of things, Paul came after them, God's choosing him before birth would actually make Paul the first apostle. Paul was further convinced that his specific role in God's plan of salvation was predicted in various prophecies of the Hebrew Bible, just as the role of Christ. So basically, I mean, this was a recap from, I forgot which chapter, but Paul says that his coming of being the first apostle of Christ was predated to the coming of the 12 apostles. So he wanted to make himself feel like he was the first apostle chosen by God for this cause, for this role. Yeah, I think brother Idris has given me contact, so just give me 1 second. Sorry about that technical issue. Yeah, sorry about that. Yeah, we have some technical issue. But since we've ended chapter 3 and we're going in chapter 4, inshallah, we're going to do a separate stream to commence our 8th episode, inshallah. So please do join in for the next episode, and jazakallah khair for listening and watching, and please subscribe. Barakallah feek. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Wa alaikum salam. Let me just do this for all of us. Sorry. Okay, so we're still good, I guess. Give me a second.
Sure.
Sorry, folks, for the issue, technical issue.
Sure.
I just want to make sure that the stream is still going ahead. I guess I hand you continued.
Not really. I was just recapping what that paragraph was saying, really. So we didn't get anywhere.
Yeah. So we're good. Let me just a few more seconds. Right. Okay. Sorry. So would you want to continue? Apologies.
Yeah, sure. So we are on we're on chapter 4, last but not least. So I'm gonna read it.
I was reading. Sorry.
Oh,
Let
you
me
was
carry
reading.
on.
Okay.
Yeah, that's all right. So I just start from the beginning.
Yes, please.
All right. Okay. Paul believed that God had selected him before his birth for a singular and pivotal mission that would determine the future of the cosmos. Though Jesus had directly chosen the 12 apostles, and in that order of things, Paul came after them. God's choosing him before birth would actually make Paul the first apostle. Paul was further convinced that his specific role in God's plan of salvation was predicted in various prophecies of the Hebrew Bible. Just as was the role of Christ, although Jesus had instructed the 12 apostles over a period of 3 years, Paul did not believe that he had disclosed to them the hidden mystery of God's secret plan, nor revealed to them the announcement that Paul referred to as my gospel that came later. And when God chose to reveal his Son, the heavenly glorified Christ, to Paul and Paul alone. Quote, but when he who had set me apart before I was born and had called me through his grace was pleased to reveal his Son to me, in order that I might preach him among the Gentiles. I did not confer with flesh and blood, nor did I go up to Jerusalem to those who were apostles before me, but I went away into Arabia. Galatians 1:15-17. Arabia, as Paul uses the term here, refers to the desert area south of the land of Israel, where Mount Sinai was located. Galatians 4:25. This rather extraordinary decision of Paul to go to Arabia is not mentioned at all in the books of Acts, where Paul heads up to Jerusalem after his Damascus Road revelation and even meets the apostles, something Paul swears was absolutely not the case. Acts 9:26-28. Either the author of Acts knows nothing about the Arabian sojourn, I guess that's a French word, sojourn, or he is so keen to have been linked with the Jerusalem apostles that he purposely ignores it. So why did Paul go to Arabia? Mount Sinai, also known as Mount Horeb, is called the mountain of God in the Torah. It was the sacred place, the holy ground, where God first spoke to Moses in a burning bush, giving him his critical mission to gather the people of Israel and bring them into the promised land. It was also on this mountain, over a 40-day period, that God delivered to Moses the revelation of the Torah. Exodus 3:16 and 34:27-28. When Moses came down from the mountain, the skin of his face was glowing because he had been talking directly to God, exposed to God's glory. Exodus 34:29. As a result of this revelation, Moses made a covenant between God and the people of Israel. The covenant and the giving of the Torah became the foundational pillars of Judaism, as Paul points out in Romans 9:4. Mount Sinai was also the place to which the prophet Elijah retreated, and it was there in a cave in the same mountain that he had his own extraordinary encounter with God, speaking with him face to face and also witnessing God's glory. 1 Kings 19:1-18. It was neither accident nor arbitrary. It was neither accident nor arbitrary choice that drove Paul into the Arabian desert immediately after he received his initial vision of Christ. Paul traveled to the desolate area not to confer with any human being, but to hear directly from Jesus Christ. Quote, for I would have you know, brethren, that the gospel which was preached by me is not man's gospel. For I did not receive it from a man, nor was I taught it, but it came through revelation of Jesus Christ, unquote. Galatians 1:12. Paul doesn't say how long he stayed in Arabia, but he does note that it was 3 years after his vision of Christ when he finally went up to Jerusalem to meet Peter and James. Galatians 1:18. That visit appears to have been a clandestine one, in which that he swears he did not meet any of the apostles, only these two leaders. One must assume he wanted to convey to them his own experience of seeing Christ and to gain, if possible, some measure of acceptance from them. It is clearly not far-fetched to imagine that Paul spent his time in Arabia in isolation, perhaps at one of the mountains that he identified as Sinai, praying, meditating, and trying to sort through his dramatic experiences. 12, he had his own 3 years with Jesus, but now the glorified heavenly Christ. In 2 Corinthians 12, Paul mentions an ecstatic experience that he had 14 years ago, in which he was taken up into the heavenly realm and even entered paradise, seeing and hearing things that were so extraordinary he was not permitted to reveal them. He uses the third person for irony's sake, but in the context he is obviously talking about himself. Quote, I know a man in Christ who 14 years ago was caught up in the third heaven. Whether in the body or out of the body, I do not know. God knows. I know that this man who caught up into paradise, whether in the body or out of the body, I do not know. God knows. And he heard things that cannot be told, which man may not utter. 2 Corinthians 12, 2-4. The idea of ascending to the third or highest level of heaven and gazing upon the glory of God was viewed within the mystical Jewish circles of Paul's day as the highest and most extraordinary experience a human could have. Moses alone had been allowed to ascend Mount Sinai and communicate directly with God, and Elijah had been taken up into heaven in a fiery heavenly chariot. Exodus 24, 15-18, 2 Kings 2, 11-12. In the first 2 centuries before Paul's time, texts like similitudes of Enoch, Second Slavonic Enoch, the ascension of Isaiah, in which Enoch and Isaiah ascend to the highest heavens, gaze upon God's throne, and experience a transformed glorifications were widely circulated. We don't know the precise year Paul writes this report in his section of 2 Corinthians, but it falls into the general range of his time in Arabia. One should not imagine Paul's conversion as necessarily a sudden one-time event on a single day, as reported in the book of Acts. What he calls his revelation of Jesus Christ was something he was taught, which implies a period of heavenly tutoring that would have involved multiple visions and revelations of the Lord. Galatians 1:12, 2 Corinthians 12:1. This particular ascent experience was one of many visions and revelations he had received. And his experiences were so extraordinary that there was some danger that he would fall victim to pride, knowing that he among all human beings had been allowed to see and hear such forbidden mysteries. Consequently, Christ allowed a messenger, Greek angelos, of Satan to harass Paul with some kind of physical affliction, he describes. Quote, and to keep me from being too elated by the abundance of revelations, a thorn was given to me in the flesh, a messenger of Satan, to harass me, to keep me from being too elated. 3 times I besought the Lord about this, and that it should leave me. But he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. 2 Corinthians 12, 8-9. Presumably, Paul refers to some kind of physical disability, and speculations as to its nature read like the multiple entries in a medical encyclopedia: epilepsy, stuttering, extreme nearsightedness, migraine headaches, and coliac, to name a few. Since Paul explicitly says the thorn in the flesh was an angel of Satan, it is more likely he refers to demonic attack of some type, perhaps causing him to be tempted in some way. This extraordinary experience of being taken into heaven and presumably seeing both the glory of God as well as Jesus Christ in his glorified state put Paul among a select privileged few in the history of ancient Israel, and in his mind, this experience superseded anything Peter, James, and the rest of the apostles experienced with Jesus on earth. One could safely say that Paul would have been this privileged experience as surpassing anything any human being had ever received. In effect, Paul had tasted in a prophetic way the glorification that would be revealed as the second coming of Jesus in the clouds of heaven. Well, I need a break after that. Any words, Salihan?
Yeah, so James Tabor introduces Paul into his journey to Arabia, where the book of Acts supposed to have written by an anonymous author, most likely authored by whoever authored Luke, did not mention anything about Arabia, and yet in the first-hand accounts of Paul's authentic letter, which is Galatians, he mentions about his travel to Arabia. Um, Now, some people may think, well, actually, most people may think, well, that's maybe it's because he's just passing by. But I think James Tabor saying that there is a deliberate uh, journey that was made by Paul. Secondly, uh, Paul uh, vehemently um, rejected that he has seen all of the disciples of Jesus, the Jerusalem church. He only encountered, I think, James and Peter, if I'm not mistaken. So he only encountered only them. He didn't encounter other disciples. Also, James Tabor mentioned that Paul's conversion was not just a single event. In fact, there was a direction that was leading towards his conversion. And his journey to Arabia and the fact that has a reason behind, which is James Tabor brings the example of Musa alayhi salam, Moses, peace be upon him, receiving the revelation of the Torah at Mount Sinai, Elijah, Ilyas alayhi salam, and Idris alayhi salam, Enoch, being ascended to the fourth heaven. I think Paul wanted that. He wanted to experience the same, so he tried to simulate that by going to Arabia. I mean, this is ajib, strange. Honestly, it's absolutely strange if you think about it. Another thing, yeah, this is another thing that's interesting. What James Tabor said. So, the disciples of Jesus, according to the four Gospels, the maximum that the disciples spent time with Jesus was 3 years, and Paul never met Jesus. So for him to go to Arabia to receive all this revelation, he wanted to have his own 3 years of experience with Jesus. And James says very clear that I have nothing to do with them. I have nothing to do with men. This is a heavenly revelation that Christ came to me. So this is actually he had multiple visions, and he went to Arabia for a reason, which is he wants to simulate to have that same parallel experience that Moses went through and that Elijah went through. Yeah, I mean, and also finally, sorry, I'm ranting. The part I'm really interested in, Brother Idris, and I want you to tell me what your thoughts are. On page 94, when James Tabor speaks about Paul being harassed by Shaitan,
Yes.
by Satan. What are your thoughts about that? Because that's quite interesting, isn't it?
It reminds me of the biblical account number 1 of Jesus being harassed by the devil, and so that's one thing that came to my mind straight away. Is almost trying to replicate himself akin to Jesus being harassed by the devil. Let me just see here. Yeah, and he talks about from to harass me, to keep me from being too elated. 3 times I besought the Lord about this, and should. Yeah, to be honest, I've never ever thought about it. That's my initial thought. I'll be honest with you.
Yeah.
Do you have any thoughts on it, or yeah?
I was thinking when you spoke about Jesus's encounter with Satan in Matthew's Gospel, it didn't come across that Jesus was harassed by Satan. Satan is testing Jesus, and obviously Jesus says that do not test the Lord your God, right? But the term harass is very, very strong term, actually.
Yeah.
If somebody's harassing you, that means what comes with it is mental breakdown, hallucinations, or trauma. And
I know what you're getting at. Yeah,
yeah,
yeah, yeah. That's a good point.
that is a really interesting, because he
Are you
and by
saying
the way,
that? Mhm.
yeah, sorry, and by the way, this is not even like, this is his own
Yeah.
personal experience. This is not something that can be verified historically. um Sorry, what were you about to say, Idris?
No, are you saying that because from the Pauline accounts, not from Acts, from the Pauline accounts, he has his vision on the road to Damascus, and then he goes to Arabia
Mm,
before meeting James and Peter the first time.
yeah,
He goes to Arabia first.
yeah,
So I guess what you're getting at, if that's the case, I'm thinking is is how much, if you do take, there's just two ways to see it. You can see it from I'm guess what, I don't know whether this is what you're getting at.
sure,
If you look at it from a historical physical standpoint, you're saying that he may well have had a mental stroke physical breakdown in the desert in Arabia.
yeah.
Or if you're looking at it from a spiritual metaphysical standpoint, he may have well been demon possessed in Arabia.
I think he may have been demon possessed.
Yeah. So that the speculation from then moves to when he then came back from Arabia, what he was preaching from a metaphysical standpoint or spiritual standpoint, was it emanating from him or the devil, or was that emanating from him as a sane man, or emanating from him as an insane man?
Yeah, that's something.
Is that
Yeah,
okay?
that's a good summary. That's something we may find out from the author, inshallah. Maybe he can give his own certain conclusion. But he did say at the end of page 94 that presumably Paul refers to some kind of physical disability, and speculations as to its nature read like the multiple entries in a medical encyclopedia: epilepsy, stuttering, extreme nearsightedness, migraine headaches, colics, to name a few. Since Paul explicitly says the thorn in the flesh was an angel of Satan, it is most likely he refers to a demonic attack of some type, perhaps causing him to be tempted in some way. So yeah, so he felt that he was attacked by demons.
But what
Uh,
I'm saying is, those who don't believe in the metaphysical could say that he had a
Epilepsy.
mental a mental physical breakdown rather than a spiritual demonic attack. So
Yes.
yeah, yeah. Okay, that's interesting.
Yeah. Hmm.
Um, I think if it's okay, Dahan, we should leave it here because we've been going
Yeah.
on for about an hour, except for my technical issue. We're probably going on for about an hour, 15
Yeah.
minutes.
Yeah.
The next one would be Moses and Elijah at Mount Sinai. That would be the
As
next
a subheading.
chapter.
No, as a subheading.
Oh, subheading. Sorry.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yes.
On chapter 4, last but not least. Yeah. On page 95.
Yeah. Thank you.
No worries. No worries.
Okay.
Yeah.
Do you want to close off with anything at all?
No, no. I think it's a new journey now. So now James Tabor explained everything about the resurrection, how the Greeks understood resurrection, and contrasted with the Jewish understanding. And um, we should be reading reverse, the backward approach. We should be reading Paul's letters first before we read the four gospels, so that everything would make sense about what the four gospels are trying to say about Jesus, and the resurrection. Um, but that was more of the historicity of the gospels and Paul's letters and Paul's understanding resurrection against how the disciples understood. Um, so now that's all part to one side. Now, going forward, James is going to focus on the origins of Christianity and how Paul became a central figure in Christianity that we know today. So this is going to be very interesting. Very interesting. Yourself, Idris, do you have any closing remarks?
Um, yeah, I mean, for me, the resurrection account was quite interesting.
Yeah.
I'd say. I think it clearly talks about the discrepancies between the accounts. Generally speaking, the Mark Matthew account compared to the Luke John account in terms of Galilee, Jerusalem, in terms of in Luke, Jesus rising to the heavens, in terms of the interpolation at the end of, which I wasn't aware of, the interpolation in terms of the end of John. John normally ends in chapter 20. James Tabor talks about an interpolation in terms of an appendix, in terms of chapter 21. Yeah, very interesting. Very interesting. We're getting there. We're like, I think we're close.
We're close halfway through, actually. We're very close.
Yeah, we're close to halfway through. I'm just eyeing the book. Yeah. Okay, well, look, thank you all for watching. Apologies for the technical issue. Again, some of these videos, understandably, are quite long. So, you know, you don't have to listen to them all at one go. You can listen to them at separate times throughout your day or your week. What I normally do, I don't know if you do it like him, but sometimes when I'm doing stuff, I listen to talks and lectures and videos in the background. So maybe that's something you can do whilst you're driving or doing something in the home. I don't know. Share the word. Please do like and please do subscribe. Any advice or comments, do leave down below in terms of things we can do differently or add some new content. And thank you for joining us. Assalamu alaikum.
Assalamu alaikum.
Assalamu alaikum.